I'm terrified. What's the fundamental thing of relations? They're not yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. If you can take your seat, then we will start our first session of the day.
So it's, say the name again. It's, what's your name? Shekhar. Shekhar Iyer. Yes, thank you.
Just like me by now, you're not offended when people torture athletes.
No, indeed, I'm surprised when they get it right.
Yeah. Okay, everyone, good morning and welcome to our conference that we have been hosting for many years here in Washington during the annual meeting and the spring meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. This year is a special year because this is the 80th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference, and as we are called Reinventing Bretton Woods, it's always important from our part to look at the way to improve the global financial architecture. And today's discussion will center around 4 or 5 topics that we believe will have some implication for the way we think about the future of the global financial system. We will start with the first session on fragmentation of the global economy, followed by the future of money, the rise of central bank digital currency, the concern of cross-border payment. We'll have an important roundtable on sovereign debt distress, and we will be finishing the day with the questions on what might be the potential priority for South Africa next year G20 presidency, and last but not least, more discussion related to the multilateral development bank working as a system. Tomorrow will be more macro sessions related to the future of monetary policy, the recalibration that we have been seeing after the period of inflation, and of course, what's happening in Europe in terms of competitiveness. And of course, we will be finishing our event with the issue of emerging market resilience. So this is a program. I want to thank all the speakers, panelists who have accepted our invitations. And year after year, you know, hosting the IMF World Bank meeting program is always a challenge because you never know who will come, who will participate, but I see always friends of Bretton Woods. And I want to thank this time our panelists, but also our partners. This is the first time that we partner with Oliver Wyman, so I want to take the opportunity to thank Oliver Vange, his partners, Andreas, Federico, and others I see here in the room for accepting to be part of this program. Tomorrow we'll be with our colleagues Maximiliano Castilli and friends of UBS. Also, for many years, we have been hosting our special roundtable on sovereign debt with the Frederick Ebert Foundation, and we'll be doing so again this afternoon. So this is our part. Welcome. And now I will give the floor to Andreas Dombre, who will be sharing the first session on fragmentation. One of our speakers, Piercarlo Padoan, will be joining us online. Over to you, Andreas, and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much, Mark, and good morning to all of you. I don't want to spend a lot of time going through introductions. I'm going to be very brief because we only have 1 hour and it's a big topic. So I think we're not going to spend too much time on it. First of all, it's 2 topics in one, Mike. Typical for you. You know, you don't like, easy topics. So it's about fragmentation of the global economy. And then you sort of got in the future of global growth, which is like even bigger topic than the first one. So we have 2 topics, but we're going to concentrate, as I have pre-discussed with the panelists, on fragmentation. I am Andreas Dombreit. I used to be on the board of the German Central Bank and on the board of the BIS, and I've been a supervisory board member of the ECB. Now, we have 4 very distinguished panelists. I don't see Piercarlo yet, but Shekhar
Piercarlo is here.
I hear you. That's good. I can see you, but
yes, I can see you. I hope you can hear me.
Now we see you too. So I start with you, Piercarlo. Piercarlo Padoan is the chairman of UniCredit. To the very right, we have Shekhar Ayar, who is the assistant director of research at the IMF. Isabel Mateos is the global chief economist of one of the very largest European banks, BNP Paribas, and Harry Farrell, last but by no means least, is a professor at Johns Hopkins. We would like to go into 2 rounds with interventions, and we would like to start with the thoughts on fragmentation. Now, we are meeting here while the BRICS countries and the BRICS Plus countries are meeting in Russia. It's kind of a, unusual situation that you have, I wouldn't say competing meetings going on, but it's also no coincidence that while we have the IMF meetings, the BRICS are meeting in Russia right now. And it's very good to understand the views of the panelists of what that means for us going forward and how we can potentially find a new equilibrium in international cooperation. So, Piercarlo, may I please start with you, and then followed by Isabel. Piercarlo, the floor is yours, and we try to stay within 5 minutes, each of us, and then have a second round of 5 minutes each, which means that we leave a lot of time for Q&A, which I think helps the topic. So Piercarlo, over to you, please.
Thanks very much. First of all, good morning to all of you. It's, of course, afternoon here in Rome. I'm sorry I could not be there in physical presence, but certainly I will follow up with your deliberations and hopefully other meetings. Well, of course, Andreas Dombre was kind enough to tell me that I should speak for 5 minutes about the future of the global economy, how to deal with fragmentation and global growth. So it's a very easy task and probably very boring. I decided to use my 5 minutes, which is now about 4.5 minutes, by trying to draw a few lessons, at least of my interpretation, of the evolution of the global system since the demise of the Bretton Woods. As you see, as you can hear, I'm not at all ambitious. Well, I draw 4 main lessons from the evolution of the global governance, which deals with fragmentation today. Hopefully, they will provide some inputs to your further discussion. First lesson I draw: in the global system, governance require looking at the same time at economics, finance, and security. This has been true since the beginning of the world, I would say, but certainly since the beginning of the Bretton Woods system, which, although this is hardly ever found in textbooks, relied on a double equilibrium, economic and security equilibrium, which allowed the relative position of the United States and Western European countries at the time to benefit from the public goods of financial stability and economic security. This has been the problem of how to deal with these two issues at the same time, in my interpretation, has always been there, only it has taken different shapes as the evolution evolved. Second lesson I draw from the experience of the post-Bretton Woods evolution is that starting from the post-Bretton Woods evolution, Europe started to be different. We had to look for a new equilibrium with a new system of exchange rates, increasing capital mobility as time went by, and therefore the need to have a European strategy about monetary stability, in addition to any global financial strategy to global financial stability. The outcome of that was that Europe started to react to a sequence of monetary crises to set up institutions at the European level that could be compatible with a global system. And although at each crisis there was a choice, the choice seemed to me, in most of the occasions, privileged convergence in Europe rather than divergence and fragmentation. So that's my second lesson. The third lesson is something that is related to what was just mentioned. Can we think of the same institutional mechanism dealing with global fragmentation? Well, we all know that after the global financial crisis, there was a major experiment, which is still ongoing, about global fragmentation governance. That is the G20, which I happened to live throughout several stages during my previous institutional positions, which had a very ambitious task of getting together not just the advanced economies in Bretton Woods, but in the advanced and emerging economies, covering more than 80% of world GDP at the time, if I'm not wrong, which could deal at the same time with financial stability, monetary stability, growth policy, with a dedicated stream work of the sustainable work, which eventually became also the green growth avenue for fragmentation. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that we cannot say that this experiment has fully succeeded, as we see new signs of fragmentation, also related to security problems. I'll stop there. My final lesson, hopefully I'm not taking too much time, is that now the world economy and system is faced with the question, how do we put all these things together? How do we put together the situation in which there is one pillar, which is the United States, another pillar, which is possibly China, and a third pillar, which is the advanced economy, the emerging economies trying to set up an institutional body with the BRICS, and final point, the need for Europe to decide whether or not to grow up as a major global power, not just economically, but also financially. Something which sometimes, although being an ardent European, I do not believe we can do, but we need to do it. And so that would probably provide a solution to global fragmentation. I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Isabel, you're next, please.
I need to press anything? No? Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here, even though it's a bit of a depressing topic that has been put on our plate. So Piercarlo talked about political fragmentation. I thought I would touch on the implications of that we're seeing so far in the economic and financial sphere. And maybe starting with some relatively comforting news is, as far as trade goes, actually, the signs are relatively limited. You know, global trade has kept growing for the last few years in line with trade in goods, that is, has kept growing in line with global GDP. Global trade in services has been going at about twice that rate. And if the latest WTO forecasts are to be believed, that is set to continue for the foreseeable future. And that has happened despite the adoption of trade restriction measures running at about twice the pace of pre-COVID, the adoption of trade restrictive measures. So why has this happened? Well, I think this has happened because the private sector doesn't want this fragmentation. It wants to keep selling to the fast-growing regions. It wants to keep sourcing supplies from the cheapest regions. It wants to keep generating economies of scale. And so the private sector is trying as hard as they can to keep trading globally, but of course at higher costs. And this had implications in terms of efficiency and inflation. But we are seeing underlying signs that not everything is well. And one of them I see in investment flows, particularly foreign direct investment. We've seen several years of declining foreign direct investment flows. The stock of FDI is now below its pre-pandemic level. And M&As were down 46% last year. So there's a big chilling effect here. Now, you could say some of it is because of high interest rates, and that may start to ease this year and going into the next. But I think a lot of it comes to geopolitics, because when you do FDI, you need to have confidence into the future. You need to have confidence that you're going to deal with more or less the same environment, the same policy environment in the future than you are now. And that's less and less the case. On top of that, countries are adopting growing numbers of restrictions to investment. The number of countries which screen foreign direct investment has multiplied by 3 in the last 10 years. And by the way, most of those are developed countries, not emerging markets. So that's, to my mind, a big problem for future growth. Andreas, a topic that you've invited us to talk about. Because for future growth, you need a lot of investment. You need investment for the energy transition. You need investment to deal with aging workforces. You need investment to embark on the AI industrial revolution. And it's going to be very hard to have that amount of investments without a stable and predictable geopolitical environment, and also without a low cost of capital. And I'll finish with this in terms of the policy environment. The theme of these IMF meetings is there's a lot of public debt out there and it keeps growing. And I think this is, unless something is done about that as well, the low cost of capital point is going to be missing and make it even harder to make globalization work. So let me stop here for the first round.
Thank you, Isabel. Now, Henry, you can add, after a political and after an economic point of view, you can add the academic point of view.
Okay, so I will begin. It seems to me that we have had 3 important ages in the last 10 or 12 years, and indeed going back further than that. And thinking about that helps us to understand where fragmentation has come from, and perhaps give some idea of where it may be going. So first of all, I think the first thing that is important is that the forces leading to fragmentation began long before the Trump era. So if you look at in particular, the age when we thought that the world economy was all about interdependence, was all about taking advantage of the benefits of the international division of labor, you see at the same time, you also see the beginnings of a different set of patterns in the background, beginning very shortly after September 11th, 2001. And very briefly, what you see is effectively the United States, post-September 11th, beginning to realize that its security interests were not necessarily compatible with a completely interdependent and relatively unregulated global financial sector. You saw the United States beginning to start to think about how it is that it could rein back in some of the forces that have been unleashed in the previous decade, make them less security problematic, and beginning to experiment with new forms of financial control, which leverage the role of the dollar clearing system and the centrality of the dollar clearing system in global finance. So this is the beginning of financial sanctions. You see the United States not in any grand master plan, but instead responding to a series of urgent crises, looking to figure out how to build up the machinery that it needs in order to turn its central role in the global financial system into a space from which it can launch instruments of power. And it becomes increasingly ambitious over the period, perhaps culminating in the Obama administration and in the very, very extensive sanctions against Iran, which propelled Iran into beginning to negotiate the JCPOA. Then during the Trump administration, you begin to see a lot of change to that. You begin to see a lot more unpredictability. You begin to see a lot more chaos. And also, interestingly, you begin to see a lot of experimentation. So during this period, the Trump administration in particular, it begins to start to think in a rather chaotic way, which reflects a lot of the chaos within the administration, the internal power battles between different factions. It begins to think about ways in which new forms of control could be exercised which are not financial in nature. And in particular, it begins to start thinking about how the export control regime could be used, first of all, to put pressure on China in order to reach a trade deal, which is, of course, one of Trump's major ambitions. And then the hawks in the administration managed to take over the process, and they begin to start thinking about how you can make export controls much more powerful and in a certain sense like financial sanctions. So they introduced this so-called foreign direct product rule, which extends the power of US regulations over international producers to a much greater extent than in the past. This is then built on by the Biden administration, which begins, I think, to first try to think coherently, to join the dots together with this vast, somewhat ungainly and unwieldy machinery of coercion, which has been developed over the last couple of decades. It begins to try to figure out how to put the pieces together, but it also starts to experiment with some of the things that have been introduced during the Trump administration, and in particular, post the Russia invasion of Ukraine, starts to think about how export controls could be applied on a much wider basis. And then this becomes the basis of Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor's famous speech, where he talks about how he wants to impose a so-called small yard with a high fence on Chinese technology. He wants to ensure that certain key foundational technologies are denied to China to the greatest extent possible, and in particular begins to leverage a United States control of certain aspects of semiconductor production. He begins to start talking about how that can be used in order to try to throttle China's ambitions with AI to the greatest extent possible. So we're now in a kind of an interregnum period where it has become clear that some of the measures that the United States has introduced have not been as successful as the US actually wanted. It's clear that export controls are much messier, much more difficult to administer for a variety of reasons than the United States had thought. We're also seeing the United States beginning to try to think about how to bring various investment control procedures together, sort of both inward investment and outward investment, which is having part of the substantial chilling effect that we have just heard about. And we are also finally seeing, of course, a lot of nervousness concerned with what's going to happen in a couple of weeks' time and the two radically different directions that can be taken. So we were asked to talk about how this might affect the global institutional architecture. This is not an area where I am an expert, but I will say that the first time that I spoke at a Bretton Woods meeting was 2019, when Mark invited me to come in on the basis of my earlier research with Abe Newman. And I very definitely felt like the odd man out on the panel, where I was preaching gloom and doom, and other people were talking about the security exception in the WTO and whether or not this could be managed. And I can remember thinking at the time, this is the exception that is about to swallow the rule. And I don't think that the world is quite as pessimistic. I think that I was a little too pessimistic, but I don't think I was that much too pessimistic. We now are in a world where effectively the relationship between security and economics, which Pierre Carlo talked about in the first presentation, has become completely, has become deranged from what it used to be. So that security issues are primary in policymakers' interests, as well as domestic stability questions. And we really do not need to start thinking about what kinds of institutional infrastructures either can be grafted onto the existing institutions if possible, or perhaps new institutions that are more directly aimed at managing the relationship between economic security and traditional imperatives of economic growth, because if we do not, we are in a world of hurt.
Thank you, Henry. We are this week guests of the IMF, so it's only appropriate if Shekhar from the IMF takes the last position in these interventions. And we're interested what your view is. But if I could ask you, please, also to think a little bit about and share your views on this high level of indebtedness we are all in, and how that can also affect fragmentation in the future and future growth, of course.
Thanks very much. It's always difficult to go last because all the good stuff's been said. I thought that perhaps with my research hat on, I could tell you a little bit about what researchers have been doing in this area, and in particular, the answer to two different research agendas. First of all, what is actually happening in terms of geoeconomic fragmentation? And second, what are the likely impacts of geoeconomic fragmentation going forward? So let me start with the first. What's actually happening? At the IMF and various other research institutions, we tend to define geoeconomic fragmentation not as deglobalized. So we're not looking at trade to GDP. What we're looking at is the tendency of ideologically aligned countries to increasingly restrict transactions within themselves and to seize or to cut back on transactions with partners that are not so politically aligned. And the way that researchers have been doing this essentially is by looking at voting patterns in the United Nations. Now, all of you will note that this is an imperfect measure, but it's a high frequency measure. There are different United Nations votes every month, so it's time varying. It's something for which we've got a long time series. It applies to all the 183 countries in the world. We've got very transparent data for them. And it's granular. So it's not like, like the alternative way of doing it is to, for example, look at security groupings. But if you do that, if you, for example, look at NATO, then you're kind of saying that the US and Hungary have a similar relationship as the US and the UK. And that's just not true. So this gives a much more finely grained picture of geopolitical alliances. So using the UN data, you can construct geopolitical distance between any two countries, I and J, at any given point in time. And then you can correlate these bilateral geopolitical distances with various economic variables. And when we do this, and there's a bunch of good stuff from the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, we find that indeed there's a strong correlation between geopolitical distance and FDI, capital goods exports, and to a lesser extent, intermediate good exports and portfolio flows, international portfolio flows. On the FDI side, particularly, not only is the relationship strong, but it's been getting stronger over the last 20 years. So it matters much more today how geopolitically distant you are for your international transactions than it did 20 years ago. So that is a clear sign of geoeconomic fragmentation. Let me now turn quickly to the second, which is what is the likely impact? For this, economists are using various modeling devices, and every two papers is like apples and oranges, right? Because it's got very different assumptions. It's got different assumptions on the blocks. It's got different assumptions on whether you can have non-aligned countries which are not connected but transact freely with both rival blocks, and various other assumptions you have to make. But recently, we took a survey of 4 prominent studies. And what the 4 studies show is that global economic losses from intensifying geoeconomic fragmentation could be anything between 2 and 12% of global output. These are very high numbers. For example, you can compare it to the climate change literature to get a sense of just how high these numbers are. And there are some common themes, despite the apples and oranges aspect, that do emerge. First, the deeper the fragmentation scenario, the greater the losses. I'll give you one example of that. If you allow a block of non-aligned countries, then the losses are less because the non-aligned countries can benefit from trade diversion between blocks. If you force every non-aligned country to pick one block or the other, the fragmentation is deeper and the global losses are higher. Second, when you put technological decoupling on top of trade restrictions, you get a much bigger output loss, especially for EMs, because, you know, technological diffusion is one of the main ways, and technological diffusion takes place through things like trade and FDI. So if you cut that channel off, then convergence between emerging markets and advanced economies just becomes that much more difficult. Third, while the estimates vary widely across countries, generally speaking, what emerges from each and every study is that emerging markets and low-income countries stand to lose much more than advanced economies. Again, this is obvious if you think about it for a minute. They are further from the technology frontier. They benefit much more from international trade, cooperation, and above all, technology diffusion and productivity spillovers. Finally, and this is a little bit technical, short-term elasticities of substitution are likely to be smaller than long-run elasticities of substitution. In simple English, what this is saying is that it'll take a long time to reconfigure global supply chains. And in the process of reconfiguring global supply chains, the losses can be much higher than the 2 to 12% of global output losses that I mentioned. So even the high numbers that I mentioned may be regarded as a lower bound in some respect. Okay, I think I'm probably running out of time, so let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If I can, I cannot summarize this, but if I can make a comment from my side, is that if I listen to all 4 interventions, and I think that the quality of this panel has nothing to do with me, is very, very high. It's clear that fragmentation is costing us a lot, but I don't hear that we are going into a full-fledged deglobalization mood, but that we're having to face with fragmentation costs, which have to be managed. Now, the institutions which have been mentioned all the time in all interventions, starting with Pierre Carlo and ending with Shekhar from the IMF, are mainly those Bretton Woods institutions. And as this is the name of the conference and the name of the organizer of the conference, it's only fair to, in a second round, really think about how is the future of those Bretton Woods institutions going to look like? What kind of long-term strategies should they follow going forward? What is the risk, or what are the risks, I rephrase, what are the risks if those long-term strategies are not being achieved? And what could be, you know, is this going to enhance fragmentation even more? And as Shekhar not quite incorrectly said, it's always bad to be last. Why aren't you starting first and then followed by Henry? And we just go in the reverse order of the first round. May I ask you, Shekhar, back to the microphone, please?
Thanks. The only thing worse than being last is being first, of course. Okay, so the Bretton Woods institutions, let me just sort of add a caveat saying that I'm not an expert on this issue, and these are my personal views. So I think, for the IMF and the World Bank in particular, one important issue that people in this room probably know a lot more about than I do is quota reform. So it's going to be very important for these institutions to adequately represent in a fair and impartial manner the views of all our membership, and to take account of how the world has evolved since the Bretton Woods institutions were set up. And so quota reform and making sure that there's fairness of representation among countries, I think is going to be essential. Earlier speakers had noted that there were alternative institutions being set up in the global south, things like the BRICS banks. And undoubtedly, unless the Bretton Woods institutions can be seen to being adequately representative, then they run the risk of losing market share in some sense to these new institutions. The other important thing that I think we have been doing and must continue to do is to have a very independent voice. So I've often been struck when I go from the IMF to country missions that many of our membership do regard us as one of the few independent voices which are sort of guided by technocratic rather than political considerations in the advice we give. So it's very important that that continue and that we be viewed as an independent, impartial voice, which is very technocratic rather than political in nature. And then specifically going to geoeconomic fragmentation, I think there's a number of things that perhaps the Bretton Woods institutions in conjunction maybe with the WTO could do. To the extent that a first best fully multilateral world becomes elusive, then I think it's very important for us to think of guardrails. So in a world where countries are behaving in a very unilateral fashion, there should be some way of putting guardrails to avoid the worst implications of that kind of behavior. And I think one thing that the multilateral institutions could foster are multilateral platforms. For example, if countries are thinking of imposing unilateral sanctions or unilateral measures, there can be a platform where at least these countries explain what they're about to do, explain why they're about to do it, and lay out the economic considerations. And then there can be a multilateral discussion about possible spillovers, about how to protect innocent bystanders, if I could use that term. And generally speaking, how to minimize, the effects of whatever unilateral action is being considered. Secondly, and perhaps at the same platform, one could think of how to put specific guardrails to make sure that the worst consequences are averted. I have in mind here things like safe corridors for food and medicine. So most people would agree that whatever you're looking at, it is essential to make sure that food and medicine can continue to flow globally to where it is needed most. So one could make sure that there is some multilateral mechanism that all countries agree to on that. This could also apply to norms of conduct about, how unilateral actions are to be carried out and what kind of discussion there should be. So I think the international institutions can play a role here. And then, of course, they play an important convening role. So, debt was mentioned. I think in the context of geoeconomic fragmentation, one thing to remember is that in the old days, debt restructuring was, to a first order easy. The bilateral creditors all belong to a group called the Paris Club. This was a relatively small and homogeneous group of politically aligned countries. They could get together and they could quickly restructure debt when needed. The share of Paris Club debt that is held by low-income countries today has greatly shrunk. It shrunk by about a third, by 2/3 since the 1990s. And increasingly, debt for low-income countries is not provided by the Paris Club, but by other actors like China, India, and private bondholders. This, in a fragmented world, this means then that debt restructuring becomes much more difficult because these countries are no longer relatively homogeneous and politically aligned. So there again, I think the multilateral institutions can play an important bridging role, bringing all the parties to the table and trying to facilitate things like debt restructuring when it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Shekhar. Now, you mentioned several times the goal of multilateralism. the question really is, maybe I can ask Henry also to concentrate in his intervention on that. The question is, are we really still in a multilateral world? I know it's more complicated than that, or are we just on our way to multipolarism and away from multilateralism, which, Shekhar, you rightly say would be something good to overcome fragmentation? Can you comment, please, on that?
Very happily. And I think that where we are on the way to is, no matter what happens, a mess. And the short version of this, I think, is that if you want to think about the multipolarity versus the continued some kind of multipolarity versus multilateralism, a lot of this concerns things that I think neither economists nor, for that matter, political scientists like myself really have thought about very systematically, which is infrastructures. We have a lot of boring infrastructures that have been weaponized. The dollar clearing system is something that people, the people in this room paid attention to. Not very many people paid attention to this outside until relatively recently. You could say the same thing for SWIFT and for other architectures. We're now also building new architectures. So some of these are being built in a deliberately multipolar way. It's clear that China would like to figure out alternatives to the SWIFT system. It would certainly like a world in which the dollar played a much less central role. But we're also seeing new kinds of infrastructure being built as well. For example, I think people don't pay nearly enough attention to the way in which compute is being distributed, and the ways in which compute is also becoming the subject of multipolarity. So I think that here it's very important to pay attention to the kinds of ways in which the United States has been looking to do deals with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. More or less, both of these countries want to get into data centers, data provision, because they want to diversify their economy. In order to do this well, they need access to the advanced semiconductors that really can be applied to AI. And the United States is imposing political conditions on that in order effectively to tell them, if you want to do this, you are not allowed to use equipment from Huawei or other Chinese or other problematic providers. And so effectively, the United States, I think, is trying to build a world in which you see two different sets of infrastructure for compute, one of which is first class and the other of which is second class. And so I think this does have consequences for the multilateral institutional infrastructure. I do think that the IMF and other institutions are going to survive. I think that this is an extremely messy world that we're heading into. If you think about the Cold War world and sort of people just concentrated on national security, you can think Tom Schelling as being the kind of economist who really sort of characterized this world. People focused on national security and were much less interested in economic interchange because there wasn't very much that was important. We then moved to a world in which we effectively devolved a lot of decisions to the market. This was the world of Hayek and Milton Friedman. And now we're in a world which is like a messy combination of the two, where national security issues and where economic issues become intertwined. And I do think that just as the IMF and other institutions evolved dramatically from their initial Bretton Woods configurations, what they have been supposed to do, I think we're going to see new institutions, the continuing institutions, taking on new roles of trying to figure out how to manage these vastly more complex interactions. But I think that if you want to look for where multipolarity versus multilateralism hits the road, it is going to be these systems. They're going to lead to a clunkier, messier, more difficult world in which it is much more difficult to consummate certain kinds of transactions than it has been. And there is going to be a need for a lot of management of these systems that are half disconnected, half integrated into each other, because you cannot completely polarize. And this is going to be a world where we're going to need more multilateralism, albeit of a very different sort, rather than less.
Thanks, Henry. As Isabel said at the beginning, it's Mark, not a very friendly topic to talk about. You get a lot of negative vibes listening to what you said, which is not your fault. Maybe, Isabel, I can ask you to take a little bit of a private sector view of this, how this will go?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you didn't ask me to take a more optimistic view, because I'm not sure I could provide that. Yes, so reform of the Bretton Woods institution. Look, it's not a new topic. I don't know, Mark, when did you create the Reinventing the Bretton Woods institution? But at least 10 years, probably maybe more than 15. So it's not a new topic if we're honest with ourselves. And a lot of the ideas that have been talked about, including the ones mentioned by Shekhar, were already sort of front and center back when I was working at the IMF and pretty much for the 15 years I was working there. And it's not your fault. It's just that these issues are there and, you know, they don't really. So yes, better representativeness of quotas would be good. Technocratic advice, independence, all that is wonderful, but nevertheless, there still seems to be a big question mark around what should we be doing with these Bretton Woods institutions, and the world is moving at a fast pace, is fragmenting, and these institutions don't seem to be really changing. Actually, there was one new idea I heard in your list of to-do things was the guardrails, and I think this is maybe one of the lessons learned after the pandemic, which was obviously a massive shock, and that's a plus. So taking you know, all of this is true and needs to be done. I would add one thing. You know, the Bretton Woods institutions have a tendency to market themselves as, you know, in times of crisis, we need more multilateralism, not less. So they're like the advocates of multilateralism. And I think that's a mistake. That's a mistake because the man in the street or the woman in the street doesn't care about multilateralism. And that's true whether it's the streets of Washington or Paris or Mumbai. The man in the street and the one who is voting in repeated elections and giving increasing support to political parties that are anti-trade, ultra-nationalists, pro-fragmentation and all that, this person cares about future growth. This person cares about their own future situation. They don't care at all about multilateralism. And so I think the Bretton Woods institutions, each in their respective, you know, mandate areas, should market themselves as the voice of future growth. And in the case of the fund, for example, that could be, you know, debunking all the policies that look good on paper and might even produce good effects in the short run, like doing a lot of deficit spending or giving a lot of subsidies to dying industries and that sort of things, but that very quickly actually are counterproductive and are counterproductive to long-term growth. So that would be one suggestion. And of course, the fund has been doing that to some extent, but I think marketing it under the heading of, you know, we're here to protect future growth, I think that might work better. The second thing is, I think culturally, the fund in particular is, you know, loves to give warnings. I don't know if it still exists. There was this early warning exercise even happening during the IMF meetings. Okay, this is great, but people, policymakers, others don't really listen, actually. It's just an observation. I think some of it has to do maybe with human psychology. You know, tell people if you overeat, you know, you might develop diabetes, but still there's millions of people who develop diabetes. Elected policymakers, obviously you give them a warning, but they're thinking, well, you know, probably will be my successor's problem, not mine. And so warnings also only go so far. And I think perhaps, you know, trying out a more positive narrative of, you know, if you do X, these are the kinds of benefits you can reap from it, might be a little bit more impactful. That's just a thought. And then maybe final thought, I think there's been even more intensely in recent years, a bit of a blurring of the mandates of the IMF and the World Bank. And I think there are really core macroeconomic policy issues that need attention both in advanced countries and developed countries. And I think it would be a really good idea for the IMF to spend a lot more time on that. And I think the new role you've been given, Shekhar, at the IMF, gives me hope that maybe this will happen. But let me pause here.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Piercarlo, we are coming all the way back to you now. And, you know, as you have been in the G20 and in the IMFC, we are very interested to hear your views on what needs to happen. But clearly the G7 cannot carry the role because they don't represent, and Italy, of course, is a member of the G7. They don't represent the global economy. It has to be something like the G20. Do you see a future for the G20? What do the institutions need to do in order to be able not to become into United Nations, where a lot of important speeches are being held, but very little is being decided? What we do need is a macro coordination role of some sort, and that's why your ideas are so important. Ending the second round, please.
Thanks very much. Well, first, before I answer your question, let me say one word about the issue of multipolarity and multilateralism. I agree that we are in a mess, as it was said, but maybe the question is, where will this mess evolve towards? We might see less multilateralism, which requires a lot of cooperation and agreement, and much more multipolarity, which implies local leadership and possibly conflict. So there will be something different from the world we sit in, and where we go will also be a function of what the international organizations do. Let me come to them very quickly. I'll come to the G20 later. Now let me come to the IMF and World Bank. 2 points which are key for international institutions. One is the governance, and the other one is the mission. The governance of the IMF and the World Bank will have to take into account the power distribution globally. If the G20 were to be again successful, as they are not yet, I'm afraid, then the IMF could very well, effectively, as it has done in the past, serve the G20 as a support body, which has done a lot together with other institutions. If that is not the case, then the power conflict, which is in the global geopolitics, will reverberate even in the IMF board. And this, as you know, takes time to be addressing the redistribution of power. Quota shares have been sitting there for a long time. The idea that came out more than 20 years ago of having a single chair for the European countries did not go, and this is a real pity. So we're in the transformation of governance at the IMF and World Bank. There is a lot to do, and I'm not convinced that there is the right political coalition globally that can push that forward. Finally, the mission. Well, in a word, I guess the mission of the IMF would be to preserve global stability and growth. Now, the fact is that global stability nowadays depends on variables and mechanisms which are very different from the ones we were used to deal with in 20 years ago. We are dealing now with digital currencies, we're dealing now with artificial intelligence, we're dealing with network effects and cyber risk. And in order to have governance of these phenomena, which may lead to a lot of instability, we need also a lot of political aggregation and political will. Otherwise, we will be facing a political crisis and an economic crisis at the same time.
Thank you. Also not making us feel much better, but probably you're putting your fingers right on the nerve. But we do need international macro coordination, and we still have to find an equilibrium in the Bretton Woods institutions. Now let's have a look. And are there any questions in the room? Because that would be my hope. For example, with regard to sanctions and how they are fragmenting the world, or otherwise, here's one. Otherwise, I would start to ask questions, but there are 2 questions here, and that's probably all the time we have. Could we have one microphone here, please? And then for the gentleman next to Marc Uson.
Thank you. How does automation and AI factor into that? Because with the advent of robotics, less and less cheap labor is needed, which will impact low-income countries, of course.
Okay, first, let's have the second question, please, and then try to answer. And there's a third question, and then we stop there.
Yes, thank you very much. Bernard Snoy from the Robert Triffin International Association. I was wondering whether the evolution that you see in the Bretton Woods institutions in response to fragmentation and also insatisfaction in the global South, given the weaponization of the dollar, could give a new chance to a broader role for the special drawing rights. My question is in particular for Mrs. Mateos Silago, because she participated, she was an architect of the Palais Royal initiative in 2010 under the leadership of Michel Candesu, Lamfalussy, Padoa-Schioppa, and others that made a number of very concrete proposals to evolve by stage towards what the IMF originally was supposed to do, and at some point to develop a multilateral currency. Thank you.
Okay, we have the last question over there. Could we have the microphone? And then we quickly.
Isn't it here?
It's over there. In next table.
You can go. You have a question, right?
There
It's
it is.
me.
Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. I'm small, but yes.
Okay.
Okay. My question is mostly to Aya and also to Mateos Lago. Sorry. The legitimacy of the IMF and the effectiveness of the WTO, in my view, are interlinked. And I will explain why. The large emerging markets that are sitting at the G20, same countries, sit at Geneva, sit at Washington. In Geneva, they argue we are not ready to take full trade responsibilities because we are developing countries. We deserve special and differential treatment, which means we're going to, in any future negotiation, we're going to give less tariff reductions and take more time. These same countries sitting in Washington argue we have outgrown our quotas. We are ready to undertake full responsibilities at the IMF and the financial responsibilities at the IMF and the World Bank. So there's a kind of schizophrenia. You have the trade ministers on one side of the Atlantic arguing we are teenagers or not adults, let's put it this way. We cannot compete on an equal footing with you rich guys. On this side of the Atlantic, we are saying that same countries are saying we are equals. So the point is, it is difficult reform always, but it is even more difficult if we focus only in one organization. It is difficult for me to imagine that China would give up or India would give up its status of developing country in Geneva if it doesn't get a little bit more quotas here.
Yeah. Okay, let's do the following in order to try to stay in time. The last question has been addressed to the two of you. So I ask you kindly to answer the tariff question. I call it a tariff question. The AI question I would like to address to Henry. And if that's at all possible, Piercarlo, whether Piercarlo could at the end address the question of how special drawing rights in a time of a potential, we don't see it very much yet, de-dollarization could play a role going forward. Can we start with the two of you and then go in that order and try to stay in time a little bit?
Sure. Thanks for the question. I think it's a fascinating one. I think the answer is simply the difference between national income and per capita income. So you're right that the two are related, but the concept of being rich or poor, to my mind, is about per capita income. You can have an enormous GDP and you can still be relatively poor. So when you look at India, for example, and you look at its per capita income, I think one could make a principled argument that it belongs in the developing world rather than in the advanced world. However, obviously, when you look at its GDP, it's enormous. And you could argue that for quotas at the IMF, what should matter more is your GDP, in addition to other measures such as how open you are, how much you trade, how widely your currency is used in international transactions, etc. But to my mind, there is a fundamental difference between per capita and aggregate income. Thanks.
Thank you. So very quickly, I think it's fascinating that you, Hector, is asking this question. Look, I think generally speaking, you're entirely right. It's probably a mistake to think of reforming the Bretton Woods institutions in isolation. There's a whole bunch of institutions that are relevant for multilateral governance out there. And we should think of them as a whole, or the global policymakers should think of them as a whole. Similarly, the World Bank, there's a lot of regional banks. It kind of doesn't really make sense to think of, how to reform the World Bank without thinking of what else is out there. Just one word to on the SDR, but not on the de-dollarization story. But I do think that as there are discussions around how to improve liquidity flows to the poorest countries, particularly those that don't have market access, shouldn't have market access, and aren't likely to have market access for a while, there is probably scope to do a lot more by using the stock of SDRs that's out there. There's already good things happening, but I know you're very eager for the SDR to play a greater role. It seems to me there are avenues that haven't yet been explored sufficiently there to use this pool of liquidity for the benefit of the poorest countries in the membership of the IMF and the World Bank.
Thanks, Isabel. Henry, your thoughts on AI and fragmentation?
So very quickly, as I say, there's also the control of AI is important to fragmentation, and the United States is looking to use this to try and keep China out. But I think with respect to automation, it's going to be extremely important, but not in the standard ways that we have seen automation in the past. There's a famous paradox with AI that things that AI are good at, by and large, humans are not, and vice versa. And among those things, it's extremely difficult to get AI, for example, to learn how to do simple physical tasks, such as fold clothes. So I think that the prospects for automation in the physical world are probably more limited than people think, at least with current technologies. Where we're going to see automation happening gangbusters is with respect to standard organizational tasks. Large language models are not, in fact, particularly good at generating artistic output. What they are excellent at doing is generating summarizations, usable summarizations of large bodies of textual information. They generate lossy but usable summaries. And this has a huge consequences for the ways that organizations work. I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago where a very senior recent official from the Pentagon was salivating at the possibility of large language models, more or less saying that if they had had access to LLMs, he would have been able to eliminate 90% of the people who worked for him because so much of his work is taking information in form X and turning it into form Y so that it can be handed on to another part of the bureaucracy. This is the kind of thing that large language models can do at scale.
Thanks, Henry. Piercarlo, last but very least.
Well, to be very quick, I think I agree with Isabel about the role of the drawing rights. They've been sitting there for decades. There must be some structural reason that explains that. I'm afraid I'm not very optimistic that they can be a decisive instrument in the future, although I urge all of those involved in these issues to ask the question, what kind of other liquidity instruments can we think of to help developing countries grow out of their situation, including digital currencies?
Thanks a lot to all the very, very good analysts. We did shed, I think, quite some light on the question of fragmentation, on the economic consequences of it. We're a little short of good answers of what the Bretton Woods institutes need to come up with. But I think, Mark, it's fair to say that the title of your organization is as prominent as ever, because we need the Bretton Woods institutions to make sure technocrats and not politicians also have a seat at the table going forward. Let me pay tribute to one person who has not been mentioned yet. That's Oliver Wünsch of Oliver Wyman, who helped Mark put today's conference together. And thanks very much for the questions and for the possibility of having this panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Back to you, Mark.
Was admirably well managed. Thank you for that. It's been the most on-time panel I've ever done.
Thank you, Andreas. So we just take a 3 minutes coffee break just to shift for the next session about CBDC cross-border payment. We have an outstanding panel. So just a very short 3 minutes to start the next session.
Contact information is perfect.
Me your card. I'll stop by, give you mine.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, if you can take your seat to start the second session of the day. And I will call our panelists to join the floor. Piero, Andrea, Ugo, please. Dante? Ah, here we are. So welcome again. We are going to start our second session of the day. Cross-border payments, CBDC, future of money in a deglobalized world. Let me thank all our speakers, panelists for the second sessions. Let me also thank Dante and Circle for your support for this event. Thank you very much. Ugo, also thank you very much for sharing the panel. Over to you. We have 1 hour for the session. Unfortunately, Governor of Central Bank of Cambodia have to cancel at the last minute. These things happen, but we have a great panel and great conversation. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. Is it on? I believe so. Okay. This is on, am I right? Yes. Welcome, everyone. So our panel is dedicated to central bank digital currencies, cross-border payments, and future of money in a deglobalized world. It is such a big topic, and we'll get started immediately. There's so much to discuss and learn, but we are lucky today with our panelists with outstanding achievements to date, as well as potential impact and influence into the future of payments innovation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Uğur Kologlu. It's a Turkish name. I am with Oliver Wyman, and among my responsibilities, I also lead our team serving digital assets globally. The way that we are going to run today's session is initially, I'll give our panelists about 8 to 10 minutes to introduce themselves and to deliver their opening remarks. And then we'll have a Q&A, and we'll try to make it quite interactive among this group. But this is for you. Please jump in with your questions in the end. And I'm going to start with Piero.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Is this on? So good morning, everyone. I'm Piero Cipollone. I'm board member of the ECB. I'm there from November last year. Before that, I spent almost my entire life at the Bank of Italy, where I had several responsibilities. And I am familiar with this city because I was ED at the World Bank for 4 years. So it's kind of coming back to DC. I took the liberty to prepare some slides to guide my presentation to make it very quick and to stay in the time. You know, it's a pleasure to be here with the topic we are going to discuss today are very timely and important because we are really facing the rapid transformation that impact money and payments. And as a central bank, we have the responsibility to provide money, means of payments for people. And the transformation that we are seeing are going to impact this mandate. In particular, I think two essential big transformation one is the digitalization of the economy, which kind of makes obsolete one fundamental means of payments that the central bank provide, which is cash. And the other big transformation is fragmentation. We had a long session on fragmentation, so I'm not going to dig into it, but I want to take on a specific concept of fragmentation, which might not be familiar with the American public, which is the fragmentation of the European payment market. It might seem strange, but after 25 years of a common currency, Europe still does not have a unique payment system. It remains fragmented along national lines. So there is no one single means of payments that covers all European markets and all the fundamental use case. So ECB is very worried about that, and we are trying to do something to deal with that. And we are moving along 4 dimensions, which I will mention very quickly. One dimension is to enhance what we call a single euro payment area. The second dimension is CBDC at the retail level, which we call it digital euro. The third dimension is to experiment with the new technology on how to provide central bank money for transactions that are occurring on DLT. And the fourth dimension is we are trying to enhance cross-border payments, which are in a very poor state. So I will say something on each of these dimensions, and I will leave digital euro at the end because I guess it's the most interesting topic for the public. So let me say something about SEPA. So SEPA is the name means single euro payment area, was launched in 2002 to solve once again a fragmentation problem in the euro area concerning the electronic payment system. So the SEPA has been a great success for 2 specific use cases. One is credit transfer, and the other one is direct debit. Today, there is no fragmentation any longer for those 2 specific cases. So sending money from Rome to Milan is exactly the same as sending money from Milan to Paris or from Paris to Brussels. There is no at all difference for both credit transfer and direct debit. However, SEPA has not been that a great success when it comes to other use cases. For example, payment at the point of sale, e-commerce, or peer-to-peer. We need to do, I mean, we remain completely fragmented on this payment use cases. We need to do better. Definitely, we need to do better. And for us to do better means essentially to support the development of payment solutions that are pan-European in scale, that are private managed, that are European managed, I would say, and that are based on instant payments, for instant payments, Europe has a very sophisticated technology and also the regulation in place. This is for SEPA. That's what we are doing to address those remaining topics. Let me jump to the wholesale. I'll come back to the digital euro. So everyone is familiar with the important transformation that is occurring at the wholesale level, right? There are many entities around the world that are experimenting to issue, trade, store, and settle assets on DLT. So the issue is, what should be the role of central bank in this new environment? We think central bank should stay in this space to provide the safest and most secure liquid asset that you can think of, which is central bank money. Has been So the point is, how do we do that? So we think, and we are working on that, we think we have to do three things. First, we think to invent, to trying to imagine a long-term solution. It could be a unified ledger, could be an ecosystem of fully interoperable ledgers. We need to develop this long-term vision and communicate to the market. Second, we need to try to invent something to move from where we are today to this long-term vision, which, because it's not easy, you don't jump to this long-term, to this steady state in one overnight. You need to move day by day and accompany the market to this development. And that's what we are doing at the ECB. Currently, we are running experiment and trial in which we use central bank money to settle asset transaction run on a DLT. We are not doing it by putting cash central bank money on the ledger where the transactions are occurring. We are doing it through what we call a kind of interoperability system. We will learn from that. We are reflecting on that. The experimentation is going on. And we hope that in 1 year time, we will be able to go on a, we call it production phase, where we can implement those solutions while thinking out how to go for the long term. Third dimension I want to mention is the cross-border. Everyone knows that, you know, this is a very serious problem. There is a G20 agenda that has been going on for years now. And we think at the ECB, we need to do our part on that. And we indeed are doing that. And we are doing that on three dimensions, if you want. First of all, Euro system, the Euro area has a very sophisticated fast payment system, which is called TIPS. It's settled matter in central bank money in a matter of seconds. It's very sophisticated. So the TIPS is also multi-currencies. So on the same platform, we are hosting other European currencies belonging to European currency, meaning Swedish krona and Danish krona. For the moment, they are using the same infrastructure. Now we are thinking to interlink them so that you can do cross-border, cross-currency transaction. The work is ongoing, and we think to go live on this in 2026. Next, we are thinking how to go beyond Europe, and we are doing that along two lines. First, find like-minded or people that are willing to interlink with the Euro system, and we are discussing with them on how to interlink. One possibility would be UPI, India UPI, and the other important thing is that we are working very closely with the Nexus project, which is a BIS project, which is a multilateral platform, if you want, so you don't have to link bilaterally. Joining one system, you will be joining all this. So those are the things we are doing for the cross-border. Let me go back 1 second to the digital euro. I want to spend really 2 minutes on that. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because the digital euro is a project to bring central bank money, retail central bank money in the digital era. Essentially, we are transforming we are inventing a digital version of banknotes. It seems a simple things, but we think that it has a very far-reaching consequences. First of all, by doing this, we preserve the freedom of people to pay with the central bank money, retail money. And this is essential because so far, the system we are living on is a partnership between private money and central bank money to provide the means of payments at the retail level. As the economy digitalizes and cash is marginalized, we run the risk to break this healthy ecosystem we have that has served us so well for so long. So preserving the possibility of people to pay even digitally with central bank money, we are preserving this healthy combination that has served us very well. Second, convenience for people. People often tell me, well, why are you doing this? What's for the people in the street? Well, in Europe, there is a big advantage because, as I said before, there is no single means of payments in Europe that you can use everywhere for all use case. So, for example, you don't need a passport to travel across Europe, but you need several credit cards if you want to go around, otherwise you don't pay. So the digital euro will allow people to pay everywhere in Europe with one single means of payment for all use cases. This is a very important advantage. Third, by doing this, we are doing something that is extremely important, reinforcing European strategic autonomy. Today, 64% of cash-initiated payment in Europe are processed by non-European providers. This is a huge dependency that we have to solve. Digital euro will solve that because digital euro will provide a platform, an infrastructure that is built on European technology and managed by Europeans. Thank you.
Okay, great start. So Andrea, BIS has been leading innovation in this space. Before I kind of pass the word to you, I'm very curious about Project Agora and how that will really change correspondent banking.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And thank you, Piero, for laying out really much of the work that is being done in this field. So I'm Andrea Meschler. I'm the Deputy General Manager of the BIS. And you're right, the BIS has been very active. And in one particular area, which is the BIS is the bank of central banks. And as you know, the bank for central banks, what is most important is to maintain trust in money. And so what we have been focusing on is particularly in one area, well, in many areas, but the one I want to talk to you today is on cross-border payments. And I think before going into Project Agora and some of the exciting projects we've been doing, I want to take one step back and recognize there is one reality. We've talked about fragmentation, we've talked about many things, but there's one reality that goes even beyond that. There has been over the last few years, a number of years, an eroding deterioration of cross-border payments systems generally. And how do we see this? If you look at, there's been a decrease in the number of FX pairs that are being traded. And there's also a significant decrease in the number of correspondent banks active around the world. And this deterioration is interesting because it's not peculiar to a particular part of the world. It's really happening globally. Of course, there is a difference between the highly liquid currencies that have access to correspondent banking, the G10 plus, from other currencies. And I think this is a real issue that not only the BIS, but the G20 in general has taken as a priority. How can we solve this problem? Now, whenever you have to solve a problem, so first we understand the problem, right? We're not doing innovation to look for a solution. There is a problem to be solved. And there are really two ways we've been looking at it. So one, how can you correct the ongoing problem in the existing system? Like, how can you mitigate the problems of the existing system? And the existing system is doing cross-border payments using the domestic RTGS system, but through a correspondent banking system. So you have the central banks, but ultimately the payments go through the commercial banks that settle the payments. The other way, and that is work that is ongoing, right? What can be done in the existing world? The other one is how can we use new technologies to come to a solution, or at least to part of the solution. And the new technologies we've been looking at is tokenization, is what Piero said, looking at how can we use not blockchain that was used for cryptocurrencies, but more generally DLT, the distributed ledger technology, to come to a solution. And what is it that why do we want to use it, and what kind of, why would that help? So the idea is you can create a ledger whether it's a unit, we've talked about a unified ledger. That doesn't mean the world needs to have one, but you create one ledger on which you have the central banks, different central banks, and you have also the banks have access to it, and they can actually directly do the transaction using tokenization. So why tokenization? Why is tokenization even interesting in this setup? Well, tokenization brings a number of things. So it's always interesting to think the digitalization of the economy has created one thing, the disappearance of cash. Not that wholesale payment was using of cash, but cash had a beautiful principle. Cash was safe in the sense, if we did a transaction in cash, right? Once you had the cash in your hand, you knew what you had in your hand, and no one could come back and grab it to you and say, "Oh, by the way, it had been already used for another transaction." So cash, and how can we recreate this ability not to do cash, but to do a transaction where once you have it, you know what you have in your hand, and this is what tokenization can do, because tokenization, what it does, it has several aspect, but it's a digital representation of the asset. But the beauty in that world is you can actually line up your transaction. If you know a transaction has many, many points, it goes to your banks, it needs to be cleared, every time it needs to be checked. What the tokenization does, it lines up all these pieces. It makes sure everything is there. The money is where it needs to be, in the right account, in the right currency. And once all of the checks and balances, including ultimately also KYC and making sure there's no anti-money laundering, once it's all there, it's lined up, you do it in an atomic way. You do it instantly. But I don't like to use the word instant. You do it atomically. You've lined it up. Once it's all good to go, you do it. And do it so you really significantly reduce the risks. The other thing is, of course, you can do programmability, the tokens, you can use smart contracts. So you can build a lot of functionalities onto your money. And you can do composability, right? You can decompose your assets in tiny pieces. So all of these things really seem to be ways for the future. And this is why tokenization is really something that we do in our project. Before going to Agora, let me take one more side step. Before I tell you a little bit about some of the interesting projects, what is important to keep? Before we go in, we don't do innovation to do innovation. Yes, of course, ultimately it is about creating a more efficient, faster cross-border payment. But it is also, how can you go there while maintaining trust in money? And what are some of the fundamentals that central banks need to keep, because those have been at the foundation of a sound and secure financial system? And there are actually very few of them. It is the ability to have a safe settlement asset, central bank money. It is to be clear who can settle using that safe asset, right? It has been regulated entities, banks. It is the ability to have a settlement, may sound a bit technical, but it is final and irrevocable. That's your cash principle. It's like once you settle your transaction in central bank money, there's no return. There's no credit risk. There's no settlement risk. You have it. You know you have it in your balance. This is what ultimately allowed to create singleness of money. This is also important. For central banks, it's not about having only central bank money. On the contrary, a resilient system is a system where you have different types of money, but it needs to be single, meaning whether a bank has your money in a bank account has the same value as the money in another bank account. Why? There's a big price to pay for this, very strong regulation. But because that money gets settled in central bank money. So whenever you have a domino effect, a contagion effect, something goes back, you may have a contagion until you settle in central bank money, because that stops it, because by that time, it's a time where it is, show me the money. And so these features, settlement, being able to settle in central bank money, the feature to be able to do it in a final, irrevocable way is really, and to maintain the singleness of money. Ultimately, it should be technology agnostic, and you should be able to transfer the value of money, and it is a singleness of money is absolutely crucial for a well-functioning economy. So this is what we're trying to do. So how could we, and so one of the things we've been looking at is tokenization, and how could we replicate the correspondence system that I just mentioned has been deteriorating using this new technology, DLT. This is Project Agora. So what is Project Agora doing? It's probably currently the largest project we're running, and it's pretty cool. We're creating a platform, a DLT platform on which 7 central banks are going to be. And it's the 7 central banks that are over the most liquid markets. So it starts all the way from the US and Mexico, by the way. So we get from Mexico, the US, we go to the ECB, and we go all the way to Japan. We have Korea, we have the Swiss National Bank, and we have Japan. So you really have not just the 24-hour cycle, but you really have the deepest currencies that will be on that platform. And then we have, but it's a correspondent banking system. So you have the central banks that will be issuing wholesale CBDCs. And you have the banks, 40 financial institutions that will bring tokenized deposits. So we're recreating that system so that banks create their own money. Right? Banks create regulated private money. The central banks issue central bank that is only held by regulated entity, but those two need to be able to transact. And this is what we're trying to do. Well, we're trying because we're building it up. And it should be the project, the first result should already be available early 2026, but it is really a path-breaking project, and we have to see where it brings us going forward. But it is, but I do want to say this is just one piece of the puzzle. So don't ever think we're trying to, create the solution to the world, but it is one very important piece. There are others that need to be worked on, and this is why innovation really it needs to be multifaceted. I will stop here.
Great start, thank you. So Dante, we'll move to you. Circle, as a stablecoin issuer, already has scaled up solutions that are being used by retail and wholesale customers. So within your opening remarks, can you please share with the group some information about market sizing and who is using USDCs and why are they using it?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's an honor to be here and an honor to be here among 2 titans in central banking. And so I'll be very, very cautious in my remarks to not get summarily declared non grata in Europe or in Switzerland or from the banking system, because actually crypto needs banks more than banks need crypto. But before we begin, though, I also don't think I would earn my opportunity to stay on this stage for very long if I also didn't cage the conversation in the reinventing Bretton Woods context. So what is cash, and what are the 3 properties of cash as a starting point? Unit of measure, store of value, medium of exchange. And on the US bills, at least, it says in God we trust. But in God we trust in our country, for example, has produced more than 80 debt ceiling crises, eroding the very confidence in cash in the first place. And as we recently saw in the banking crisis, the failure of any one bank erodes confidence in banking. And so the starting point, and I think it's a really important starting point, having been one of the protagonists of a small project in 2019 with a little white paper and a tagline that said reinventing money, word to the wise, never ever move fast and try to break things when it comes to money. It's your fast track to a public testimony at the Senate and House and everywhere in between. But there really genuinely is at the global level, and Piero hinted at it, a lack of true competition in the way money moves, and the lack of acknowledgement that in the 21st century, money has to also take a form in which you could argue in code we trust, not just in God. Because guess what? If you kept your money inside the 2-tiered banking system or in the brick and mortar banking system, every dollar that you put in a deposit is fractionalized for an important function that the banks carry out, which is to, of course, create credit and leverage and liquidity and lending, but it would not withstand, no bank in the world would withstand a flight of deposits, which is why this critical guarantee model, this public backstop is so essential. And so the notion that in God we trust and in code we trust becomes this kind of evolution of money in the sort of reinventing Bretton Woods context, we should also acknowledge a couple of very critical things. And my central banking colleagues hinted at many of them. The first is, since 2019 till today, the world and the central banks particularly have been embarked on really nothing short of a digital currency space race. The space race in many ways was informed by two big issues, big tech on the one hand and China tech perhaps on the other. But part of what underpins it is this threat over a long horizon of shifting away from the dollar system. The post-World War II oddity of history is that so much of global commerce depends on dollars. The last piece of the puzzle, of course, and also just to kind of cage this in the context of cross-border payments, is the rails on which money moves matter more than the money itself. And I think what's true historically, we have had many a conversation, I've probably antagonized a lot of them, about which token is a better token, CBDC versus stablecoin versus deposit tokens. And I'm willing to forego that if you get more proximity to the central bank, the better, irrespective of whether you're a bank or a non-bank actor in the payment system. Central bank money is the safest form of money. And obviously the steady hands and often the invisible hands of central bankers are really critical to protect monetary policy. But the real underlying technological breakthrough and the real underlying opportunity, and we can call it tokenization or DLT, is this notion of internet scale money, always on money that doesn't take bank holidays and that allows for transmissibility. You don't weaponize a currency, you weaponize the rails on which a currency rides. And so part of what's also informing the global digital currency space race is, of course, this ability for financial institutions, non-bank actors, and states themselves to effectively have forms of exchanging value at scale in the cross-border context, away from the long arm of US and Western soft power. This is an acute issue in Europe right now, obviously with the war in Ukraine, but it's an acute issue around the world. And I think it's part of what has given rise to censorship-resistant alternative payment systems innovations. So Circle, not to bury the lead. Circle is a company that has shown over its 11-year history that you can have a free market-based model for competition in digital currencies that could scale, but that at the same time would not only respect the norms for how money moves, but in some ways enhance them, right? So since we first launched USDC more than 5 years ago, today, this is a $35 billion dollar-based innovation, strictly comprised of cash and US treasuries. So if the US economy sneezes, we catch a cold. And it's hard to also transmit that type of immediate transmission of either economic risk or banking system risk in any other form or in many other forms of the banking and payment system. But our product is designed to be, to some it's a narrow bank and to others it's very strictly purely a digital dollar. But in designing it, we were trying to also solve the cryptocurrency industry's original sin, which is that despite this breakthrough innovation of public blockchains as a way of resolving the accounting world's double spend problem to ensure that any transaction could in fact be irrevocable and that you would have the digital breadcrumbs from origination to end, was to solve the issue of buyers and spenders remorse. If you spent your Bitcoin on buying pizza, you probably spent a lot of money on pizza, and then you would fail the intrinsic value question. But USDC is functionally a dollar in, a dollar out. Arguably, it may have been the worst performing investment in all of the digital assets markets over the last decade. But what it is designed to do is to do the things that your cash could not do if your cash was just physical. It's worth noting that if I came to a financial crime regulator today with an innovation called cash, they probably wouldn't authorize it because of its anonymity, its opacity, and in the context of a pandemic, the ability for cash to actually spread disease. Some countries during COVID-19 laundered their physical bills and money. And so USDC in 5 years has supported more than $17 trillion of cumulative transactions. And the real breakthrough, again, is this notion of nothing more than a basic internet-connected device becomes a payment endpoint. And so this is where I actually think, instead of thinking of this as a fierce contest between public authorities and central banks and non-bank actors, I actually think these innovations are entirely coexistent. And maybe even so going places where banks and central banks cannot go. And it all hinges on the rails. To me, projects like Project Agora, I don't know how to pronounce it with the accent on the A, but Agora or Agora, there you go. Or Agustin Karsten and Nandan Nilekani's Finternet concept. All of these things are right and noble, but in many respects, by design, they cater to institutions. And so I think of Agora, and I think of the Finternet, and I think of unified shared ledgers as intranets or extranets of value. But if you genuinely want to build an internet of value, you have to ensure that every endpoint on the network can in fact be connected. And so I think of this as completely coexistent with the emerging rules. I would then say a couple of quick things and then I'll end so we get into a lively discussion. So if the rails are the things that matter, then over time, you could substitute the token that rides on the rails completely and entirely. So if today's generation of stablecoins, some of them not worth the code they're written in, just like some bills in the world are not worth the paper they may be printed in, then we could also argue that over time, the ability to substitute today's generation of stablecoins for tomorrow's deposit tokens, or better still, tomorrow's versions of hybrid central bank digital currencies, great. Because guess which regions and guess which currencies will actually win the digital currency space race? It's the currencies that enjoy the network effects. Digital money is Moore's law meets Metcalfe's law meets network effects. And all of those things coming together means that today, $170 billion of digital currencies roughly represent the dollar. So the dollar arguably is the leading digital currency here, despite the fact that the Fed is almost never likely to issue at least a retail CBDC. And so what we need to try to promote in time is interoperability. The best way to do that is through regulation, and I'm reaching my final comments, is through regulation. And so for the last 13 or so years of this digital currency industry in the private market, it's been riddled with all kinds of terrible things. Internet funny money, outright scams, FTX, and horrible things in between. But the second the world starts to regulate, and the Europeans are leading the way with the markets and crypto asset structure, you create legal and regulatory certainty for this asset class, and you pull these types of organizations into the perimeter. Circle's the first to do so under MiCA out of France, not exactly a jurisdiction for regulatory arbitrage, where stablecoins are treated as electronic money. And so now you have like for like legal parity and clarity. Now I think the next frontier, and this is why I do think public money matters in digital form as well, is the Europeans are the jurisdiction that created portability of your telephone and your mobile number away from the clutches of companies. I think there's a powerful opportunity for Europe to also lead the charge in financial portability, in digital money that can be rendered on any internet-connected device that enjoys the full faith and credit of the central bank and the banking system, but that cannot be taken away from you. Because the second it's taken away from you, it's actually not your money. And if you have to pay someone to hold it for you, effectively, the money isn't rendered as a public good. That's my comment.
All right, thank you. So digital euro is on its way. And I believe about 100 countries are experimenting central bank digital currencies, more on the wholesale side than the retail side. So that's coming. And then Circle is not the only stablecoin issuer. I just checked, and there are about 200 of them. Probably 195 are not relevant, but they exist. And then bankers are not in the room. They want tokenized deposits. There are other initiatives, tokenized treasuries, this or that. So there's a lot of innovation just coming together. Dante already declared sort of his color that these are complementary and they should coexist. But are they really competing? Well, can I just hear from you, Andrea, on this topic? And if you believe that they will coexist, by the way, how would we really solve the interoperability problem?
Oh, I have the answers. No. Look, thank you, Dante. I mean, it was a very, very nice way to painting it out. But I do think before going to that answer, we need to always remember, what does technology change and what has always been there? We're talking about different types of money. They have always existed. And it's important to have different types of money. The question is, we need the core of the financial system must be running on good money, but good money also needs competition from other types of money. So let me just to simplify, because it may help you to put in a bucket all these different types of money. So cash is disappearing because of digitalization. But then we've always had central bank money, right? The currently bank reserves, right? So that is money that they issue, and the only regulated entities have access to that money. That's kind of the counterpart of the heavy regulation banks or regulated institution under. That is what, but banks in the end, what do? They don't only hold central bank money. In fact, bank reserves used to be a small part of the balance sheet. What is the rest of the money they have? Is money they issue. It's commercial bank money. Now, singleness of money allowed commercial bank money to have at par with central bank money. So you have central bank money, you have commercial bank money, or what I call regulated private money, but then you have unregulated private money. And here is where you have, and you've always had unregulated private money. It can come in different forms. In Switzerland, actually, we've always had a number of unregulated private money. Some countries were a bit more restrictive on this. And nowadays, with the technology, we have different forms. This is where we get different forms. And so at the far end, the first one that came were crypto money. So highly unregulated, more speculative money, as you said, because the value would change quite radically. Closer to commercial bank money. So if central bank money, commercial bank money, what is the next one? Stable coins. The closest one are fully backed stable coins. So they're backed 1-to-1 with fiat money. These are really interesting, right? In the end, let's see what they are. If they're fully backed, they cannot have any leverage. So if they're fully backed, they can be very useful in an economy, but they are ultimately a payment utility. Because you're fully backed, you cannot take any leverage. Then you have stable coins that are not really stable. So it's just a matter to understand what you hold, because they are not fully backed. So they may have a different in values, and a number of stable coins that you have seen, they are tradable, and they will not, the prices changes, and they may not be at par. And then, as I said, the last one are cryptocurrency that can really change it. So this is kind of your landscape of money, lots of different types of money. The point is not to say these are, we don't want this type of money. It's more, how do we maintain safety in the system as a whole? And the point is, this comes back to what is the role of central bank money? Where do you want it? The big question is going to be going forward, how much central bank money do you need in the system to make it resilient? How much needs there to be commercial bank money? And that's really the risk, that is the job of regulated entity. And how much, what kind of business models are there for asset-backed, fully backed stable coins like they are, because they can play different version. Of course, you will need interoperability. The singleness of money can only exist between the central bank money and regulated financial institutions. And that's the question, right? Stable coins, some countries are starting to regulate them. So they might come under that hat. But it's really about having room for different types of money. What is important is for consumers, investors to understand the difference, to fully know what is it that you have in your hand. But from that perspective, I think, let me just go to one more thing that Dante said that is really important. He mentioned that rails is really what matters most, more than the money. Yes and no. I actually do not think technology will not create trust in money. Technology doesn't do that. Bad technology clearly puts it at threat. But technology in itself, what is it that creates credibility, that creates trust? It's governance. And governance comes through institution. And in the end, you don't need credibility and trust in good weather times. You need it in bad weather. And this is where you need a central bank with a lender of last resort, the ability to come in and to have some measures when something goes wrong. And so ultimately, a key question that is going to be in whatever we're creating is what is the access to central bank money? Is that going to be changed? And these are not things that have anything to do with the technology. These are policy questions where we need to see how do we develop the financial system to maintain the trust, to maintain, and yet to have a system that is sufficiently flexible to be able to embrace technology. I'll stop here.
Piero, can we hear from you about this?
Yeah, Andrea said it all. Let me add a couple of issues. I think at the end of the day, it's a full question whether there will be competition coexist. For some specific use case, you will have competition. For others, you will have complementarities. And this is true for any technology. At the end of the day, if you think, right, people have needs, and we try to fulfill these needs. Think about a very elementary example. Everyone needs to move, right? We need to move as a basic need that we have. But how many technologies do we have to fulfill these needs? Depending where you have to go, depending how much time you have, depending how environmental concern you are, you can choose several types of solution, which also cover not just, and none of those is superior for all use cases, for all preferences of people. So this is again one case. For example, everyone is declaring cash debt. I'm not completely sure about that. No other means of payments has a resilience of cash. Those countries that are close to Eastern Europe, let me put in this way, they are really concerned about what can happen if for some reason electricity goes off, some cyber attack occurs, you do not pay. Now, we don't have the slightest idea, but imagine a world where you cannot pay electronically for one day. Would be a disaster. So I'm sure people will keep some cash in their wallet just for resilience. Actually, there is some country that are implementing this solution as the resilience, ultimate resilience. So they are asking people to keep some cash in their wallet just in case. So I don't think there's going to be one single solution that is good for everything. There will be, for some use case, there will be competition. For some case, there will be coexistence. One thing is important though, which goes to what Andrea was saying. We need to make sure that there is a continuum, that these means of payments exchange one-to-one. Otherwise, we fragmented the system, and certainly there are welfare consequences to that. In this sense, the centrality of central bank money is pivotal. And that's why I was referring before, that we need to keep this healthy equilibrium between central bank money and private money, whatever form, whatever technology they rely on. But it's essential that these two systems coexist. Let me start.
Okay, thank you. So let's move the discussion to geopolitics. Dante, you were not here, but in the earlier session, we talked a lot about geopolitics, which is surely reducing interdependence and integration of countries. On the other hand, blockchain is promising a more decentralized, more connected world. So the question is, how does deglobalization impact digital money? And I think you can turn the question around. And how does digital money perhaps reunite the deglobalized world?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a tall order to answer the question, but I will try. I did want to comment briefly though on a point that Andrea made, which is right. The role of central actors is really defined most in a crisis. I mean, even in the most decentralized corners of the digital asset markets, whenever there's a run or a loss of confidence on something, people are calling each other informally to figure out how to manage a crisis. So I entirely agree. The point of the rails, though, is about identifying this sort of gap in the utility value of money itself. That if we looked at the role of the dollar as an international currency, I have a paper for Bretton Woods looking at precisely this question of how do we protect the dollar from technological obsolescence. it wouldn't be enough for the Fed to upload the dollar onto the internet. Because that would represent a form of digital dollars that play to the wholesale two-tiered banking system. And the known actors would have the known services that they provide with whatever marginal improvement a digital dollar would provide. The question then is network effects. And that's where I think the internet offers us some really teachable examples of how technologies develop when they start to scale. And then the experience of digital money around the world, again, all of the early versions are prototypes. Early flight was terrifying. The early internet was the dark web, but they're prototypes, but nonetheless, they work. USDC went from 0 to availability in 200 countries in 5 years, in part because the technology layer on which it rides is entirely open source. So for little more than an open source wallet and the use of these shared ledgers, I think of the shared ledgers as financial services shareware. And there may be issues with what they provide, but their functionality is incredibly simple. And in technological terms, it's not a surprise that stablecoins have become the kind of killer app in this market, is because it is universally available at the speed and scale of the internet. But it's the network effects and the utility value that in my book is the key breakthrough of money in this kind of digital form. And Andrea and Piero hinted at many of the attributes: programmability, composability, the ability to set rules, and then the critical link, of course, is the degrees to which it's interoperable with the real banking system. If you don't want digital money to be a monetary airline mile in which you could only use it on a single network, it has to be widely interoperable. But there's a trend here, right? The United States, for example, is an outlier compared to the advanced economies in not having, for example, a federal payment systems charter. You can go anywhere else in the world. In my tenure at Circle, I've gone from 0 to a major payments institution license in Singapore. I'm the first company fully licensed under MiCA in France as an e-money issuer. And here in the US, we're taking a bit more of a laissez-faire approach. If we do nothing, we'll at least try to do no harm. But it's, this is an industry largely defined by both dollars as the reference currency and the exportability of US dollars as the asset that can reach billions of people potentially. But we're not doing it because of a national industrial policy. We're doing it despite it. And you look at the rest of the world and you look at the way central banks are interacting with, for example, Brazil and Nubank and this kind of currency industrial policy that is emerging around the world. A lot of countries are getting the recipe right and the balance right. And at the heart of a lot of it is actually their degrees to which they can decouple themselves from the dollar system, the degrees to which they can protect their domestic monetary sovereignty and monetary policy, and the degrees to which they could respond to these alternative payment rails that in some respects, one person's stablecoin might be another person's encroachment on monetary sovereignty. There's a very real set of complex issues there.
Got it. I really wanted to make this session a little more interactive with the audience. So I think a lot had been said, and this is a huge topic. There's so much to discuss, but I think we are ready to take some questions from the audience. Why don't we start from here and then go there? It will be great if you introduce yourself and then also who should take the question.
I'm Robert Blum. I'm an economist. I want to pick up on your "In God We Trust" theme. There's a well-known slogan in American lore that would traditionally be posted at a tavern or a bar that says, "In God we trust, all others pay cash." In other words, where they would refuse credit to people. And so you could take that slogan maybe and turn it around and so on. But my concern with the digital issue is how compelling is it? First of all, a lot of the discussion we're having is discussion we've had already. One of them, for example, central banks. There's been a long discussion about the need for central banks before this came along. Once I asked Bob Mundell, who was my teacher, on his question, because Milton Friedman was a real defender of central banks, but there are a lot of free marketers that say. And Bob's answer was, Milton Friedman was a monetary socialist. So that discussion is an old discussion, but more in particular is the demand and the purpose of digital currency. We've already had a discussion about cashless societies or the very need for cash before this came up. Because of what? Credit cards. Nobody uses cash, carries cash, so at least paper cash. And so credit cards are already this is digitized. People are doing all of this, of course, but you're required to have an account, and there are entities and so on. And then there's the other question about issue in currencies or the basis for a currency. And there's the concept of what's called a vehicle currency. A currency starts out getting legitimacy by being used as a vehicle for trade of goods or services. And one of the problems with digital currencies is that I think the usage of them for actual transactions of goods and services is very low. That they're sort of an investment or an entity unto themselves. They're with their own purpose for investment. They're sort of self-fulfilling. So my question is, is there really enough? Are there new problems, and are there really new problems? And is there, a strong enough real need for digital currencies, on the basis of what we have already and the basis of discussions that have already taken place?
Yeah, can you take it?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yeah, keep it super punchy. That was great. I love it. And I'm going to borrow the line about in God we trust, for everything else use cash. The short answer is, the denomination of a payment is in whichever currency the buyer and the seller are willing to accept. And one of the conundrums of crypto assets generally is that probably 100 million people around the world are now participating in this market. And so there is this human psychology at scale that is sort of driving a lot of these. The next challenge, though, and in just purely the payments or the store of value use case, millions and millions of active wallets around the world are holding dollar-denominated stablecoins, the current only proxy we have at scale, as a store of value, because guess what? Getting access to a dollar account in many parts of the world is very difficult. And for that alone, there's an extraordinary use case. The payments use cases as well are real, right? MoneyGram, accepts on and off ramps denominated in digital currencies. The UN itself used these networks for digital cash assistance in Ukraine. Visa, MasterCard, and every household name firm is using digital currencies effectively as a settlement asset on their networks, in part because what we're really trying to compete with is the walled garden problem in payments. That's why I go back to the rails, drive utility value. If tomorrow a central bank said to a company like mine, you have to hold your cash custody at the central bank, and you now have this pure money representation digitally, we would totally forego the middle part and stick to the network effects, the utility value, because that's where the real competition lies.
Piero, Andrea, do you have any answer?
Two quick points. I do want to pick up on great question. Why do we need central banks, and why do we need digital? Do we even need to think about this? Again, why do we need central bank? To me, it's not in God we trust, but you need trust in money. And what is the role in central banks? Three things. Around the world, they really have three functions, very simplified. One is, how do you create a stable value in your money, right? It's a purchasing power of money, so that you have a $10 bill, or in whatever form you want to have, you can use it in a year, in 6 months, in 2 years, it has the same value. That is monetary policy. That is what a central bank does. That's the role of stable prices. The other thing, you want to be able to maintain the value of this money intertemporally. That's financial stability, the second part of the mandate. And the third part of the mandate is to be able to use the money that you have saved whenever you need to. That's payments. And that's often the third kind of mandate, or a very important area of central bank. These are very unique mandates that central banks have to provide, because you have this centrality that is required to do that. And then in terms of digital money, what is interesting is the world is changing. And one of the things, the world is becoming more digital, and it is becoming faster. We all want to pay with the ease that we're sending WhatsApp messages. Well, here you don't use WhatsApp so much, SMS messages, right? We want things to be fast. The reality is the rails, the traditional rails, are T+2. It takes you at least 48 hours. You may have credit cards that work well domestically, but cross-border, it's very slow and very expensive. In the world, we talk about deglobalization, which is in fragmentation, absolutely a reality. But the reality, we're in an incredibly global world. So the fact that these issues are really deteriorating is a problem in a world that, global supply chains, right? Resilience of the economy. You require a good global system. And so the question is not, do we need a digital currency? How can we maintain a system that allows you to do safe, secure, and cost-effective payments domestically and cross-border? And I think there are still gaps.
Piero, do you have views to add, or shall we move to the next question?
Just one observation. Again, I would be careful in declaring cash debt. In Europe, still 43% of the transactions are done through cash. Cash is handy. It's preserve privacy that for European, at least in some Euro area, very important. And last but not least, is very inclusive. You don't need to have a PhD in physics to pay with cash. And sometimes with these new technologies, you really need to be techie savvy to pay. So inclusiveness is an essential part of our mandate because we provide a public good, and especially for the most fragile part of the population. We should not think, the mainstream, we should think also to the tail of the distribution.
Okay, so we'll take two more short questions and then there's lunch. We are happy to stay as long as you like, but please.
Thank you. My name is David Lubin. I'm an economist at Chatham House in London. I'd like to ask about Enbridge and particularly bringing kind of geopolitics back into discussion. Recently, Anton Siluanov, the Russian finance minister, Russia currently being the head of the BRICS, they're having their summit in Kazan at the moment, talked about creating a BRICS bridge. And given the fact that the members of Enbridge are currently either existing or future members of BRICS, is there a scenario in which BRICS might kind of grab Enbridge and convert it from a system that's currently operating in a sort of G7 friendly environment in the BIS Innovation Hub into something that is less G7 friendly?
I suppose that's for me.
No comment.
No, the great question, right? So look, Enbridge is a project. It's it's different. It's looking at the similar question than Agora, but it uses a different setup. It's a setup where you have central bank, wholesale central bank money only. You don't have tokenized deposits, so it's a different setup. Look, it was created before, before the geopolitics became really the focus of it. What we're doing is we're doing projects. The idea is our projects should all be currency agnostic, right? The idea is how do you provide new solution for the cross-border system. And where I want to be very careful before I go into the explication that the BIS projects are not to be used to circumvent any sanctions. And the BIS project actually cannot be used or even being observed by sanctioned entities. So we're being very careful about this. Now, what happens in the future? Look, we do project because not because we want to be cool, because there are needs, there are questions that need to be answered. They need to be answered in an open way. We need to look at different technologies, different setup. We need to be very open, and we need to work with different central banks across the world and with the private sector. And this is what the BIS Innovation Hub has managed to do. And Enbridge is one of those projects. But at some point, the project take their own maturity, and then if there's a demand by the central banks to take it further, they do so. And then it's no longer, then it comes out of the project and it becomes a real value system. So what will happen, I don't know, but what I can tell you in Enbridge, it's very clear who gets access to it. It's very clear who does not get access to it. And it's very clear what the question was and what kind of the use case they are that we do with it. All right.
Okay. I'm Stéphane Pouyan. I'm the chairman of Green Power House. It's a financial backbone to support energy transition. Before that, I spent 20 years at Euroclear. So I have a little bit of an idea of a centralized system and a decentralized system. On the real-time payment, Euroclear is a mega machine that actually process immediately thousands of cross-border transactions. So I'll say that in some respect, the digital economy has been built by JP Morgan, 56 years ago. It's always needed to improve, but the technology has been there. Now, I have a little bit of questions on the new technology, the tokenized technology, and the rail, as you call it. I just would like to have the panel opinion on the challenge that we see with social media like Facebook, but on the real side of digital tokenization. There are so many scammers out there that are just have as a mega focus the ability to steal money because it's too complicated for the normal person to figure out what to do and what not to do. And that is hurting significantly a decentralized approach because there is no one to call, not even the police. So that's the first question. Now, the second question is on the other side. It's for the centralized approach. If you look at the Russian sanctions, and now I'm making a very clear distinction between sanctioned entity and non-sanctioned international investors. There has been non-sanctioned international investors that are not even in the selection process of the financial intermediary chain that have seen their assets seized for the last 2 years with no one caring on how they could retrieve their own asset. And so this is a fundamental right. It's a very big problem. We are talking about geopolitics. I am not an economist, but if tomorrow morning we do the same in Hong Kong, it will be seriously bloody. And talking about the BRICS and the consequences of non-action by the European Commission, European countries, and everybody involved, everybody pushed the can or kicked the can down the road in Europe, and same here in the US. That has a ripple effect on the behavior of those BRIC people who believe that what has happened once can happen twice at a different scale. So one centralized question and one decentralized question. Thank you very much.
So I'm happy to provide some comments. I mean, first of all, thank you for the questions. As early as the WannaCry ransomware attack, I think it was in 2016, which went from 0 to 130 countries over a weekend, and the ransom was payable in Bitcoin. The law enforcement communities around the world love what digital assets represent, even the totally decentralized kinds, because of this feature of digital breadcrumbs. And despite the efficacy of the ransomware attack, you crippled the entire healthcare system of the United Kingdom. The digital wallet that got the proceeds, very small, something like $80,000 worth of Bitcoin was payable to a single digital wallet. The entire world was trained on exactly that wallet address. And as a result, they got away with the ransomware attack, but they didn't necessarily get away with the money. We saw a very recent case here in the US with the Colonial gas pipeline ransomware attack as well. And many countries around the world have built local digital fire brigades that can respond when this type of illicit activity occurs. And so I think prudential regulators, banking regulators, and payments companies and others would be well served in bringing the activity into the perimeter. The Financial Action Task Force was the first of the global sort of bodies to start harmonizing rules for precisely what should happen, irrespective of the digital asset that was being traded. People should respect the travel rule, and no surprise, the industry hardened, and you started to see this up-leveling around the world to the extent that you could even conceive of delivering a very good payment in a very, very bad country. Our own experiences in moving digital money into Afghanistan, into Venezuela, Ukraine in an active war speak to this notion of fast internet scale money, but that is still responsive to either sanctions or financial crime compliance obligations. And when you regulate the market, it's a very, very hard market to conduct illicit activity. The noise around what we call FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and social media campaigns, unfortunately, again, Piero said it earlier, cash is the very best of the financial inclusion monetary instruments because of how basic it is. And a lot of these new technologies are, of course, the space where lots of exploits happen, in part because people are motivated by fear of missing out, or they think they're buying something that is in fact not really there. I can't fix that other than to say, again, the more you regulate the space, the better. And last word is we shouldn't do things with enforcement that would be solved with better risk disclosure. We should presume agency of end users and customers in any market. And I think it's a critical feature of cash as well. You know, use at your own risk. And in some cases, the money doesn't necessarily convey around the world.
Can I do want to quickly, so cash, you know, we think of cash, but cash is central bank money. And that is a little bit your issue. Like you need to make sure you have at least one means of payment, you know what you have in your hand, right? So central bank, that's why, you know, central banks are, some of them are very, very elaborate in what kind of cash, because so that you know, you can recognize it. But that's one issue. The other, I want to pick up on the point that you made about non-sanctioned entities that have no longer access to the payment system or that have the assets seized. That's exactly part of that broader problem of the deterioration of cross-border assets. Is there's been a rise, and for the right reason, of AML, of CFT, of checks that need to be done against sanction. But what has happened for the banks, the risks have been tremendous for very little utility of what the money they get for make those payments. So fewer and fewer banks are willing to make those kind of transactions. I'm not saying they're bad, but it's just you don't have the right papers, you don't have the right information. And this is part of the problem why cross-border banking, not for the G10, but for smaller country, for EM's country, for countries that don't have either stable currency, it can really become a hurdle. And the point is, so tokenization, different system may help. Another very important area is AI, right? AI and collaboration. Collaboration, can you get data sets together while maintaining privacy so that you can do those checks faster? You need them almost on an instant basis, faster, and to really being able to identify the good, the bad, the ones that are really fully legal, the ones that need more paperwork. So this is another area that we're really working, not just at the BIS, but together with different jurisdictions to see how can technology help in that point.
Piero, anything to add?
Nothing the interest.
Okay, well, we discussed a lot. Thank you for your attention and time. My takeaway is future of digital money is very exciting. You guys want to add one final sentence?
Nothing more exciting than lunch.
Okay, let's have lunch. Thank you. Thank you. I know how to reach. Oh, don't worry.
Thank you, my friend. Good, sir.
Yeah.
Stay high down there. How's everything? Well, I think it's well, so yeah, Thank you. I'm sorry, there's someone in the section. And when you how do I get that? It's a social But I would be very happy He just needs to be able to. How many chips you end up with? Yeah, he's right. Okay, we have next question. Well, I mean, almost there.
Okay, let's continue our conversation, and now we are going to start the next sessions on MDBs working as a system to fight climate change. It's a great pleasure to welcome our chair, Eric Bergloff, and our all panelists for this afternoon session. Eric Bergloff is the chief economist of AIB, and he will be the chair for this afternoon session. Eric, over to you, and thank you for joining.
Yes, so can you hear me? Not really. How does it work? Can you? Yeah, wonderful. So yes, very welcome to this session, and welcome to those who are online watching this as well. Indeed, it's a session on making the international system work as a system, and there's been a lot of focus on MDB reform, and making the MDB system bigger, better, and bolder, and been quite a lot of progress. I've seen it in my own organization, but also in many of the other MDBs, and a lot of collaboration across institutions to get more out of the money that has been allocated to these institutions. But there's a lot left to do also on the MDB reform agenda, and we'll come back to that. The aspect that I think has been much less emphasized and much less reflected on is the role of the IMF and the MDBs and how they can work together as a system. So this notion of the system working as a system, I think, originates in the Eminent Persons Group that was presented in 2018. And that was originally created by the German G20 presidency, and it deliberately included both the development architecture and the financial stability architecture. And the idea was that by having the finance ministers and central bank governors at the table in the development discussion would make it, much more impactful. And I think when we look back at that report from 2018, it has had such a tremendous impact. It didn't immediately because it wasn't picked up by the two immediate G20 presidencies, but then the Italian G20 presidency picked it up, and then it has been now by 3 successive emerging market presidencies being pushed very strongly, maybe most particularly by the Indians and now by the Brazilians. And I think we have a representative for the Brazilian G20 presidency here who can really explain how much has really happened. And we have said it's about climate action, but of course, climate action is something that has many dimensions. There's of course the climate policy, but there's also the issue of building state capacity in countries to implement the climate or the net zero transition. And that this is the largest, I would argue, challenge to state capacity anywhere, but particularly in those countries where it's in shortest supply. So that's going to be one aspect of what we're going to talk about. A third aspect is around the absorption of all these financial resources that will be needed to finance these technology transfers to countries. We don't want this to build up another debt mountain and in foreign currencies. We need to think about how can we get local currency solutions, or how can we train and build these capital markets or local financial systems so that they can absorb all these resources that will be needed to finance this development. So these are the kind of issues that we will be talking about. And the idea would be that we start with IMF, and then we talk about the approach. This is relatively new activity at the IMF, but we know that already it has been very impactful, and we're going to hear a bit more about that and several related areas of work that IMF has. And then I suggest we go to Anna, who is not Manuela Ferro Wallenstein. Manuela developed laryngitis and she could have been here, but she wouldn't have been able to hear what she said. So I thought it was better that we got a replacement. So thank you very much for short notice stepping in for her. And then at the very end here, we have Arunava Ghosh from CEW, the leading think tank on climate, I would say in India, but maybe even globally in the emerging world, has been very important for India's policy process and thinking through the issues in India. So I didn't do a proper presentation of individuals here, but now it's the president. No. Sorry. So maybe I'll do the introduction as we go through. So each speaker. So Anand, maybe you start first.
Do I introduce myself?
Yeah, you can introduce yourself.
Thank you. So I'm Prasad Ananthakrishnan. I head the Climate Finance Policy Unit at the International Monetary Fund. And thank you for inviting me, Eric. So the IMF has recently got into the area of climate. Prior to 2021, we were still dealing in climate in an ad hoc way. But in 2021, there was a board-approved strategy on climate that integrated climate-related challenges in our surveillance, capacity development, and in lending activities. And this was resourced as well as this was staffed by the strategy, so we could get into all these aspects in one form or the other. Now, strengthening the collaboration with the multilateral development bank community is a priority to the fund. And I'll talk about 3 areas where we are strengthening or we are having excellent collaboration with the multilateral development banks. The first is on climate action. The second is on domestic resource mobilization. And the third is on SDR channeling. So on climate action, since last year, we introduced the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. That Resilience and Sustainability Trust of $48 billion so far was created from channeling of SDRs from the advanced economies. So from this trust, we are extending credit to vulnerable countries, which already are in an IMF program and who are on the track to macro financial stability and who are implementing reforms in institutional frameworks in macroeconomic areas, as well as governance and other related issues. So the financing that we give goes for budget financing, and it is for long-term balance of payment stability, but this is accompanied by reform measures in the areas of climate, which is typically on, for instance, public financial management, public investment management. It can be on information architecture, it can be on carbon prices, or it can be on regulation in some power sector or electricity sector. So usually it comes with around 12 to 14 reform measures. The program is for about 2 years. Repayment is after 20 years. It is as a share of quota, but the maximum that a country can get is around 1 billion SDR. There are some countries that have taken 1 billion so far. So in the last 18 months, we have extended credit to 20 countries. And we have so far committed $8 billion, and we have disbursed around $2 billion. Now, in executing this resilience and sustainability financing, we have entered into enhanced cooperation framework with the World Bank and with the IDB so far. We are also working informally with all the other multilateral development banks, but these have been announced frameworks. With the World Bank, we are collaborating in 5 countries. So the framework involves that we identify climate challenges jointly in a country. So far, through this framework, we have done work in Madagascar and in Tanzania. That's the first point. So we will come through our public investment management, public financial management. The World Bank has this product called the CCDR, which is the country climate development reports. So in order to make sure that there are no overlaps of reforms and there is no duplication, the teams collaborate with each other while going and giving loans. The World Bank, the timing of the loans of the World Bank and the IMF may not be the same, but they come with their development policy loan, and we will go with the resilience and sustainability facility so that there is some scaled up climate financing that is given to a country. This is also accompanied with technical assistance. And the third most important thing is that the World Bank and the IMF have agreed that they will help countries establish country platforms, which we have been doing, and I'll come to it in a moment. Now, with the Inter-American Development Bank, also we have got into such an enhanced collaboration framework with the focus on surveillance and macro policy issues. We have come on collaboration when we are lending to the RSF and their lending operations. And the last thing there also, we have said that we will work together in the Western Hemisphere region to find climate finance solutions through innovative instruments. And yesterday, for some of you who may have attended the IMF World Bank meetings at the IMF, Barbados announced a debt for climate swap, which rested on some of the reforms of the IMF with Asian development, with IDB and European Commission giving guarantees for the debt swap, and the GCF and the IDB coming and giving upfront financing. So it had all elements of an reform measures in the water sector, where the country had to come with some decrees. So based on that fundamental reforms, institutions like the GCF and the others were willing to get upfront financing. European Commission and IDB gave some guarantees. So there was a debt swap with accompanying loan. So these are some of the instruments that we are working together with these countries. So that was the first part. Second thing is I mentioned to you about domestic resource mobilization. You all know that the G20 group, the independent expert group, had estimated that $3 trillion are required each year until 2030, 2 trillion of which should be from domestic resources. So the IMF and the World Bank are working together in a few pilot countries. Like, how do you come up with this domestic resources in countries? It can come through taxation, improved spending efficiency, and development of local currency capital markets. These are priorities. So we have been working on this with the World Bank. Now, even for the G20 report, which Brazil is chairing, the IMF and World Bank work together to look into the mitigation of foreign exchange risks, especially in infrastructure financing. A major component of that is going to be development of local currency markets. And I'll end my first intervention with the last point, that is the SDR rechanneling. So the IMF board recently approved that the SDR, use of SDR as hybrid capital in multilateral development banks. And the African Development Bank and the IDB are the two institutions that are at the forefront now, which have been talking to SDR holders to get capital with them, because once the SDR is allocated, as some of you might know, it becomes reserves in some countries. So it depends on countries' rules, regulations, and the will of the country, whether they will be able to part with the financing to the multilateral development banks as risk capital. So there are some issues there, but these institutions have been speaking with some of the donors. And from what I understand, that money is coming into the capital of these three, so that will enhance the capital. So I'll stop here for now and then take it up later if something comes up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you could hear how all these three activities are very closely related and are very much part of the climate effort. The